So Cuba is currently in an economic crisis following the US's intervention in Venezuela, where we essentially just black bagged their sitting president, Nicolas Maduro. And I just did an analysis on what's going on in Cuba, why it's happening, how it affects the country, and what the future will probably look like. Cuba is experiencing energy shortages, economic paralysis, and humanitarian crises. These obviously aren't new to Cuba. It's something that's been going on in Cuba for a long time. But right now there is a oil blockade like there was in the Cold War. There is now another USA oil blockade on the country, Cuba, which is only 90 miles south of us. Cuba's kind of always been this black sheep where the US has been unable to, or completely uninterested in doing anything with Cuba. The primary mechanism of what's going on in Cuba right now is the structural inefficiency of Cuba's centralized socialist economy, which has long relied on external subsidies to mask its inability to generate self-sustaining growth. So this is an island nation. It's very typical of island nations that it's very hard to generate self-sustaining growth other than tourism. Since the 1960s, Cuba's model has depended on foreign intervention. First, the Soviet Union was providing $4 to $6 billion annually in aid until 1991. Then Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro, they were supplying up to 100,000 barrels per day of subsidized oil at its peak in the 2000s. Now it's around 35,000 barrels per day. This dependency has created this feedback loop in Cuba where state control over resources completely stifles innovation, entrepreneurship, productivity, and then subsidies allow the regime to just avoid reforms completely. When the US captured Maduro on January 3rd, 2026, and seized control of Venezuelan oil exports, halting shipments to Cuba, it completely severed Cuba's lifeline. Secondary mechanisms of this include the chronic underinvestment in infrastructure, like Cuba's aging power plants that experience frequent breakdowns, and then also bureaucratic systems that prevent rapid adaptation, such as diversifying energy sources or liberalizing markets. The term sanctions cause poverty are kind of misleading because this blockade, this oil blockade, it accelerates collapse, but the root of that collapse is just systematic in nature to Cuba. It's a system where 70 to 80% of the economy, 70 to 80% of Cuba's economy remains state controlled, leading to complete misallocation, prioritizing military spending over renewables. As of March 3rd, 2026, Cuba's oil reserves are estimated only at 4 to 7 days. So they only have 4 to 7 days of oil reserves. And it used to be, in January, it was around 15 to 20 days. Daily power outages average around 15 to 20 hours nationwide, with peaks at around 64% of the grid completely offline during high demand, affecting Cuba's population of 10 to 11 million people. Fuel shortages are paralyzing transportation, with bus services completely reduced by 50 to 70%, aviation grounded intermittently, tourism revenue is down 40 to 60% year over year, exacerbating the GDP contraction projected at 5 to 10% for 2026, which is probably high. Right now there's roughly 1 million, 10% of Cuba's population. There's 1 million Cubans fleeing since 2021 and a lot more trying as well. This is due to the strained labor markets and obviously everything else that's going on in Cuba. Historically, this mirrors the special period, it's called special period from 1991 to 1995 after the USSR's collapse, when GDP fell 35%. Calories per capita dropped to 1,800 to 2,000 daily, leading to widespread malnutrition, and blackouts lasted 16 to 18 hours, which is kind of what they're experiencing now, and the regime survived that with slight partial reforms. Today's crisis is sharper in energy terms. Oil imports are down 50 to 70% versus the 30 to 40% after the USSR fell, but milder in scale due to a small private sector. So the reason it's not that bad right now is because the private sector is now 15 to 20% of Cuba's GDP, up from basically zero. Cuba's domestic oil production is 40,000 barrels per day against the demand of 100,000 to 150,000 barrels per day. Without Venezuelan oil, the gap is 35,000 to 50,000 barrels per day, equivalent to around 2 million gallons lost daily. So this is really brutal on Cuba's economy because all economies run on fuel. run on energy. A common thing I'm seeing is where people are wrongly framing the crisis as solely a product of US aggression, portraying Cuba as a resilient victim of imperialism. This stems from ideological biases in media and academia, which romanticizes Cuba's revolution while downplaying the internal failures. I went to Cuba in, I believe it was 2016, and Cuba's economy was quote unquote thriving, but every grocery store I went to was empty. Almost every restaurant I went to they didn't have enough food. I went to a pizza place, they had no flour. So this has been a common theme throughout Cuba's history. After the revolution, they've been unable to kind of make it as a self-sustaining country. However, pro-Cuba narratives amplify external blame while ignoring data like the World Bank estimates that removing state controls would boost GDP growth 4 to 6% annually, and that would compound if you could just remove the state's control over all these sectors. The truth about Cuba, it's not collapsing overnight, but it's eroding slowly, and it's been eroding slowly for a long time. And this blockade is exposing a lot of vulnerabilities. It's not really creating them, it's kind of just exposing them and widening those cracks to larger and larger gaps. The Trump administration is claiming humanitarian intent, but is designing loopholes favoring private sector to potentially enrich US firms via like resale licenses. Cuban officials right now are skimming aid, obviously, while around I think 3 to 4 billion a year they're skimming to create informal economies that bypass state taxes. This the structure of Cuba makes the crisis worse. Shortages are boosting elite control via rationing while deterring foreign direct investments less than 1% of the GDP. Best case for Cuba, I think, would be if the US allowances expanded, fueling private sector to about 40% of Cuba's GDP by 2030, and then reforming to decentralize the economy, try to attract 5 to 10 billion FDI, yielding 3 to 5% annual growth and stabilizing energy via renewables, which I think would be a pretty good plan for them. The worst case for Cuba is if this blockade tightens. Obviously, they're going to run out of fuel reserves by like this year, 2026, probably mid 2026. It would trigger famine-like conditions, mass unrest. 20 to 30% of the regime would try to leave, most likely, maybe more, leading to this like chaotic transfer or like need for intervention. What's probably going to happen for Cuba is they're going to get some partial relief via loopholes that the Trump administration is making for private sector companies. Power outages will probably continue to last 8 to 12 hours a day, which is absurd. And then they're probably going to try to slowly reform to hybridize economy, a weird state-private mix, and then they're going to continue seeing about 15% of population loss. And if they don't go full US, they'll have to geopolitically depend on China and Russia to get rid of that low-level stagnation. But I think that's China and Russia have a lot on their hands right now. The US seems to be making the world stage really chaotic, with just eliminating Nicolas Maduro, claiming we want Greenland, illegally starting a war with Iran. So this all creates a really strange future for Cuba. And without their elites abandoning some central control, without them letting go a little bit, the regime on its current trajectory will probably collapse by 2030 under just like pure self-inflicted greed and power-hungry elites. In order for Cuba to continue, they're going to have to stop pillaging states' resources, which is something they have historically not been able to do.